All right, and let's continue on. Because we've been having some issues with file paths. So this is what we're running into. We wanted to display this image in an HTML file. We finally got it working somewhere in here. There we go, embedded. We ran into some of the issues there with the source tag. We minified a URL and put it in there. So that's called what is called an external reference. So, but you're going to run into this all the time. Not only this, you're going to be running into this when you are dealing with those style assets, image assets, script assets. Every day, you know, if I have to work on, when you're working on the web, if I have to switch gears and work on some React, they're files, they're JavaScript files, and sometimes I can't find them because I'll show you why. It's a little bit more, it gets tricky, right? So this file path, so in order to display that local image, you need to be able to write a path. If there's a file called index.html in your directory, which means in your directory on your desktop or in your directory on your server or cloud or whatever web space you have. So, and there's another directory called example in the same directory, which means you kind of have nested, directories. The path would be example/file name, meaning that your file exists in the example folder. Let me just exit this for a second here. And what I'm trying to tell you is if you had a folder here and we created say we had a folder, how can I create a folder? There we go, a new folder. So suppose we have a folder called images. So if our file is here, it's not in the root, it's in the root/images, right? That's where it would be. It would be in this root file, which is lab2/images. Kind of translates to this path. That's my desktop path. So I'm in lab2, but then I'm in directory called images. So it can be confusing. It can be a little confusing for that. Sometimes you can't find it, but it gets really tricky because if you are in, and I may confuse you here, but this is what you'll run into, right? If you have a folder called HTML and you had a file, you have to go back. Your image needs to go back to the root level and then into the images file. So there's a way to do that, and you need to use the ... and I'll show you that in a second here, but it gets a little confusing. So anyhow, if we are in the root file folder, imagine that being images and the file name. It will know where to find it. But it gets very tricky, right? The local path, computers have directories, which I just showed you. Operating system like Windows, Mac, Linux organize all your files in a tree of directories called the file system, with the topmost directory being called the root. So we were in lab2, that was our root directory because that's where our HTML file that we're using existed. That's called our root directory. And then we have subdirectories of that file, of that directory, if that makes any sense. That contains all other directories. Within the root directory, there could be files, there could be directories. Within those directories could be more files and more directories, and so on and so forth. So you can get again, we're talking nesting now. Now this is another way of building a tree. And you could probably visualize if you have a directory structure that maybe is 6 or 7 levels deep, you need to be able to navigate through all of those directories to find that file. And it's very easy to get these paths wrong. I get them wrong still every day, and it sometimes takes me like 5 minutes to try to figure out where my current working file is, how many levels I have to go back up, and then how many directories I need to go into. And you're going to find that. You're going to find, sometimes you may be, from this path here, you may be saying, okay, I need to go 1 level back. I need to go into an image file. I need to go into, assets, and then I need to find my file, what could be called, beach.gif, right? Sometimes I need to go 2 levels back. I need to go into something called website, and then I need to go into images, right? So you end up getting into some of this stuff, some of these crazy paths, right? Paths like that. You can already tell here that my IntelliSense is actually telling me that there is something there. There is a folder called 2019. There is a folder called BCD 1006. Inside of that, I do have an exam. Inside of that, I have a file, or I have another directory, which I have another file. So one of the other reasons of using Visio Code is it'll actually help you out a little bit, which is very helpful. Otherwise, you have to manually try to figure this out, and it's very easy to miss one of these decimal places or slashes. So this is what this is saying right here, right now, is that saying I am in I'm in full stack lab 2. Now I'm going back. Each dot represents 1 level back. So I'm going 1. I'm going 2 levels back. I'm going 3 levels back. Right. So now you can see there I have a 2019 directory. Now I'm going 1 level deep, 2 level deep into exam 3 levels, questions, and then finally I found the file text I'm looking for. So in a way, this allows me to navigate that whole path, and it can get very confusing, to be honest. And if you ran into a little bit of it, let me tell you, you will run into more of it. So if you're not,
I have a question similar to this. Is it okay if I ask it now?
sure. I can't see anything right now, so go ahead.
Okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned something like, if suppose we want to go to, let's take a JPEG file, for instance, and we are coding in the index.html file, and that JPEG is in one of the directories within that same folder, or the root folder where the index is. But
Yes.
suppose we are currently working on a different HTML file which is not on the root folder, which is, so let's take this very directory that we have open. So suppose we are working on a different HTML file.
Right.
Which
Suppose
is in
our root
exam.
file is here. Okay. So let's go into I forget where we were now. Let's see. We were in full stack 1. We're in lab 2. So you're saying if we were in this folder here, HTML, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we needed to go, we're not in the root file, we need to go back 1 level, and then we need to go forward 1 level. Is that what you're saying?
So, okay, could you please go to labs, and perhaps I think that would be a better example. If you could go to like 1 folder back.
Here.
Yep, there we go. Suppose if we have our index.html file here.
Yes.
Okay, and we can have like multiple HTML files, and suppose we landed up in a different HTML file that lies in, let's say, lab 2 folder.
Yes.
So in that particular case, the relative path, will it have lab 2 folder as the root directory, or will it still be using labs folder as the root directory?
No,
For
the
the
root
absolute
directory,
path.
for this file that you hit is lab 2.
Okay, so wherever that HTML file is, it will take up the path according to its own space. So there is no dependency to the main index file.
No, the only dependency might be is if you have a root file here in labs, and you
Mm-hmm.
have an asset folder here, you need to go 1 level back using those dot slash. You need to use a dot slash, and then you need to go, so that will bring you back to labs. From that point on, then you would need to hit the next folder you might need. Suppose you have a folder called assets here, right? So you're always
Mm-hmm.
conscious of where you're navigating to. So you may need to go 1 level up, 1 level back, and then you need to go wherever that folder asset file may live.
Yep, that we can do. So, okay, one different question. I mean, in Linux, we have a concept of a root directory, which is like slash. That is like the starting point of that tree. And like one single period is the current directory, and 2 periods is like the previous directory. So
Yeah.
here there is no concept of starting from that single slash and then
No,
maybe
so if
because,
you wanted to quickly go to the root folder, there's a tilde like that.
oh, okay.
So tilde will bring you back to the very root element of this file. So
Oh,
that's
okay, perfect. Thank you.
yeah, so that's like a Windows thing, a different operating system, Linux and Windows. So you're going to run into that all the time, right? So we are talking about local paths. Local paths can be on your operating system, but remember, it can also mean that local. So that's local path, your local operating system, Windows, Mac, Linux. We just talked about the differences now between finding that root file, that topmost directory, and there's different ways to access it. As we reiterated, think of this as a directory structure, much like we would look at the tree structure of the HTML elements. We have a tree structure of the directories, right? So that point here, we have root and then slash all of these directories here, right, are basically one level deep, and then inside of those they have their own secondary levels here, and you can tell that users has been highlighted, and now we have these other ones here as well. So think of it as a tree, and we need to navigate up and down the levels to find that asset, as even as simple as an image or just a tiny little, some type of icon or avatar, can easily break on a site. If you ever notice in that example of the broken image, happens all the time, happens in many public sites. So the concepts we were talking about that's confusing is this concept of absolute path versus relative path. It's one of the more trickier things, confusing things that we've already talked about. You've already run into. It is already admittedly very, very confusing in HTML. Not only do you have to worry about linking to images, you have to, like we said, link to other pages, other components. So a relative path looks like this. So what that would say, the browser would interpret as, okay, this file is on the same level as, say, in the current calling page. It's in the same root path. So that's where it's going to look. If you want to go one level deep, you're saying from my current root directory, it's going to look up the navigation system and try to find this image. At the same time, you can go many levels deep to try to find the website page. So this is called the relative path. It leaves the browser to try to build the tree for itself and make some assumptions about that. But you can be very explicit as well. If you notice an absolute path, you can be very explicit. If you just want, if it's not working, I'm just going to show it. If I can view this in my browser, then I must be able to view it in my source. You don't really want to, if you just want to get it working, that's fine. Best practice though is you don't want to be using the full path, because number one, you can reveal to somebody viewing the code exactly where some of these assets are. If they were smart enough, they could figure it out anyways, but also it's just a lot of extra text. And best practice really is, if it's in your website, your container of your website, it's on your server, you should use it relative paths. If you have to link externally, like if you have to link to, say, an external site like google.com or you need to pull some assets, it's perfectly fine. It's acceptable. But those are the two differences, relative and absolute paths. So two differences there. The absolute path always includes the domain of the website. There is something called, I might have mentioned it before, it's called CDNs. They're called Content Delivery Network. So you're often going to get some of these options. For instance, if you were going to, let's see, why not we look around the web here. All right, CDN jQuery. All right. All right, so I could either go to jQuery.com and I could download the entire, and I've seen it because some companies like to have all their assets downloaded and minified. Otherwise, if I don't want to download all of that, I can go and link directly somewhere in here. Where's the CDN now? Where is it here? CDN. Please help me out, jQuery. CDN. Getting started. So, all right, trying to find it here. Hosted libraries for Google developers. So let's see if this works. But really what it is basically it's an external link. Okay, here we go. So here's an external link to jQuery 3.5, minified.js. We all understand what minified is basically and when we look at that. So anyways, that's what it is. Look at that. Minified means there's no spaces and all that junk. It's not junk, sorry. It's just been compressed. And basically what's that saying is I don't need to download all of this in my build or my machine or my project. I can link externally to it and pull it in. And then it's really good if you're freelancing and you just want to go and you don't want to worry about adding more files to your project. You can just quickly link it externally. You know it works. All well and good, right? So that's an example of why you might want to use an external link, and it's called a CDN, Content Delivery Network, and there's a bunch of there's many of those things out there. But when you get into the corporate world with private software, they may have legal issues around that. They may want to host all their own assets, and you would be surprised. Some financial software companies actually have a lawyer who approves what files and packages get inside of a piece of software, so they can't get sued. Yeah, so that's one thing. Kind of restrictive sometimes. All right, so relative links point to a path, a file or a path. We already talked about that. When I was gonna say something else, but when a user clicks a relative link, that browser takes them to that location on that site. So it figures out, like we said, where it is. When the browser sees .. it knows to look in the folder above the current directory. So it goes back one level. You can use it as many times as you need to, and you can navigate that whole tree. So someone raised their hand. I can't see the question, but go ahead if you have
So
Yep.
I actually had heard about CDNs such as Akamai. Is that related to the CDN that we discussed here, or are they
Akamai?
different?
Akamai? Oh man, you're saying a word you're saying a word that's given me nightmares the last few weeks. But sorry, Akamai is actually a caching,
Mm-hmm.
kind of a caching network. So it's a little different. That's way more involved. That basically deals with caching of HTTP requests, and it can do things with headers, and that gets really, that's a whole nother level. That's like $100,000 like corporate license fee for that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So so that CDN is not this. I mean, these two are different things, but I'm not able to understand what exactly is this CDN about. Is it like a library that we are using without actually installing it? Is that what?
Yes. So right
Okay,
here,
perfect.
so I'm using something called Google Hosted Libraries,
Mm-hmm.
and it says these are stable, reliable, globally available content distributed network for most popular open source JavaScript libraries. So direct links, and they're hosting them. They're hosting those files. You can expect them to be very reliable, and there's no.
Oh, okay. So kind of, I mean, I have like a different example, but okay. Suppose if someone installs Python and wants to do data analysis on it, then there are various libraries such as NumPy and all
Yeah.
those. So those are installed in the system. But
Yeah, so
in this way,
similarly with .NET, they have the NuGet package and npm. Those are installing the current assets in your local application internally.
okay, but with CDNs, there is no need for that installation at all. You just have to reference it and you can use it.
Yeah, so when we're talking about web and we're talking about JavaScript and browsers, this is a link client side to pull that file down.
Oh, okay. Thank you. This is quite simple and easy, in fact, than I was thinking it to be. Thank you.
Yeah, if you have another perception of what it is, you can easily go down that rabbit hole. And for those of you that don't have context to it, there's many different ways to deliver content. But yeah, we need to keep in mind we are focusing on browsers and web.
Hi, Mike. Quick question here. How do I stop somebody from grabbing data from across the border that shouldn't be used? The reason speaking to, I can't share privacy data across borders.
Sorry, grabbing data across the border? First?
So, example, your social insurance number may be on in Canada, but somebody in the US is accessing your company's data. They're accessing the social insurance number on the Canadian side for use in the US, which is illegal.
Oh,
so
okay.
I want to stop somebody from accessing the Canadian data.
Well, you could use.
How do I do that?
Yeah, you could use geolocation to figure out where those browsers are coming from. And there's a whole bunch of libraries and even HTML5 things that you can actually figure where the user agent is originating from. I mean, it's not going to be an easy kind of thing to go about, but if you can track where they're coming from, you can at least try to protect it in a way.
Okay.
But then they can also mask it through IPs. So you get this problem. This problem is a common one, and it's not something that can be solved with one line of code.
Okay.
But just know that everyone faces your problem. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But let me get back to you on that one if you know if what we talk about doesn't help you out. But that's a good one. Again, that's a real life problem that we run into. The web gets interesting. We're trying to get yeah, it gets we can talk about this stuff and then relate it to many things that we're going to run into. So you can already, if you're already asking these kind of questions, that's good, because you can kind of see where all this can go. You know, it's not just simply content on a site. It can be very explicit, something like social insurance numbers that you do not want people to access. And data security is a huge thing. So you can imagine, yeah, so this is an external file, but like some companies don't want that. They want their own data, their own security. So therefore they don't use CDNs, they use their local files with absolute path. And yes, so the added bonus of using this is that it forces you to keep your site's structure neat and organized, which is always good when you use your absolute paths. You know, it helps you. Relative links are easy to do, but you know, you have to hunt down all of those different paths and things like that, and it makes for a lot of work for a developer. So you know, we could talk about that one, but I'll let you guys run into those issues. You will, trust me. So let's move on to forms. And so forms are really integral to web development, as I said. And maybe I'm only saying it because I'm a developer and I'm used to working with forms. Sometimes I've worked on projects that was just form after form after form. If you're lucky enough to work on some very cool stuff, like data visualization, like it all depends on the projects. That stuff's super cool, right? That's there's a lot of interesting projects out there, and then there's a lot of cookie cutter projects out there where you know you might get in a company and that's what the software is, like you know, capturing information for. I worked on the project that or a company that did GICs and RESPs, which are, you know, in Canada, the retirement bonds that you can use, right? In the US, they have, I forget what they are, sorry. But anyhow, you get that idea, right? It's just mutual funds, investments, and inside of all of that is all sorts of crazy logic, but they all come down to the business rules and how the forms work. So pages and pages of forms, right? It actually gets a little bit boring after a while, but yeah, so you need a variety of projects. You need a variety of cool stuff. I've done, like, I'll explain to you some other projects I've done that were super cool, but at a basic level, there should be some type of way to capture the user's interaction, whether it be on a phone and it just has that spinner scrolling and tapping your selection, right? that's all dressed up. At the end of the day, those are just kind of controls, input controls, right? Something as simple as this kind of form, you add layers of CSS on it and you can make this look beautiful. But for when we're using markup, it's going to look like this. It's kind of bland. All right, so just to reiterate, so HTML provides a whole library of elements that we can use for forms. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to go through the important ones that I think, but there's many different types of inputs, right? As you know, we'll look at that forms guide in a minute. But to master these forms, it is more than just HTML logic. When we are working with HTML, we're just making this initial view. There are some built-in attributes that make your life easier, but there can be layers and layers of styling going on, scripting knowledge. When you get into validation of the forms, there's some built-in stuff with HTML5, which is nice. But then there's also, specific widgets you can build. You may be, when you're getting into like React and things like that, you may need like I said before, like some type of credit card specific component. Maybe you need a store selector. In my current job, we have to do selecting the current store for express pickup. So we need to make a little widget for that handles a drop-down selection and does a bunch of stuff based on some business rules. But at the end of the day, they're all interactive web forms, and we know the internet is, has many of them. They're all powered by CSS and JavaScript. So that's what it's going to look like in your page when you're doing your lab question 5 and 6. Hey, I'm just happy if it looks like that. We're not dealing with the styling. If it looks like that, we're good. And we're just going to build some forms out. But in order to do that, we need a form element. And this is the bread and butter of any form. Any web form is this tag. This tag signals to the browser that there's going to be some behavior inside of it. At the basic level, there can be some kind of post or action that happens that maybe the form refreshes, as in the old days of total reload of data at the very minimum or basic level. But newer applications, they frown on that, but we won't go there. So each time you create one of these HTML web forms, you start with this element, and then you start nesting inside of this form all of those other controls that may go inside of it. And there's lots of technologies, plugins, and utilities, right, that can discover the form elements and implement special hooks into them. And there's a lot of them, and it's a whole career learning them, to be honest. But at the end of the day, wow, I have a element there kind of overcoming that there, but at the end of the day, they're interactive controls for submitting the information that the user might have. And this doesn't really go in big action here. I'm live here. Okay, HTML form element represents the document. Select the interactive controls. It looks like that with the form element tag, and it has a method on it. So these are the attributes here. The action can be empty, but action can be, if you look it up, it can be post, it can be get. The method can be post, the method can be get. So we never talked about post requests and get requests. That kind of speaks more to like the JavaScript part of it. But the action at the minimum can be a URL. You can say, okay, on click of this button, I want to go to this URL. So something's happened now, and therefore I am redirecting the whole page to google.com or whatever, what have you. So we can look at this list. I just provided a small list, right? Form, field set, legend, text area, label, button, input. Why not use our docs? Take a look at that, explore it a little bit. Some basic forms out there, but then there's some really, so here's a basic form. So if we take a look at this, we have an action attribute right now is empty, but we have a get request. So the get request, we're not posting back. So get and post, there's two different distinctions there. And then we just start nesting, right? We start nesting, we're building this first element here. So if I were to slowly kind of cut this out, at the bare minimum, we have a label. So we haven't looked at that, but the label is what you would think it is. It has some text, and then it has a text box. The text box right here, again, has some attributes on it. It says it's meant for type text. It has a name and an ID, and it's required. So that's an attribute there that can be used in validation for your form. And then we have another element there called email, and then a different kind of type. We're saying that it's an email, and we're saying that it's required. So this is really cool. This is a cool attribute in HTML5. We didn't have this baked in before. We had to do some special stuff to make these things required. On submit, so this is a button that does submissions. So if I click this, oh wow, look at that. So this was never available to us before. We had to use widgets for this. So what this is telling me is if I enter data in, now it's gonna be smart enough to, HTML5 API is gonna be smart enough to add some type of validation to my form, which in a couple lines of code here is quite incredible. If you've ever seen the original way of doing this. So this is saying now if I fill this out, it's gonna give me some validation back saying it needs to be an email format. This is amazing. Again, if you've never gone through the pain of this, you won't appreciate this, but right there, that's, for me, I'm sold, right? Because I've had to do this manually. I've had to download old school, jQuery validation libraries to make something like this happen. But now out of the box, we got it. So if I change this button to type, it may not work as expected here. So I broke it. So it didn't like that at all. All right, question here. So what's the difference between post and get? So if we really start talking about this, we're moving towards HTTP requests. And we're talking about, and we're gonna learn all about this stuff about JavaScript and RESTful calls. So what a GET request is like a read-only request for data. So you're just getting a bunch of data. When you're doing a POST request, you're doing submitting. So you can think of this, if you have a request that's a GET method, you're just kind of retrieving, you're triggering with your form that you're gonna get some read-only data to display on screen. If you're doing a POST, you're saying, I'm gonna save this data, whatever, I'm gonna persist this somewhere. Maybe it's in a database, maybe it's in a cloud or local storage or something like that. We're gonna use those in later sessions, so it's a good thing to talk about that. Do we need to create these many divs? No, you don't. You don't need to be honest. If you utilize some of the newer versions of HTML, you don't need to do this, but you see this example is using classes with CSS, and they're really leveraging this container and then putting styles around it. But you don't need to do that, to be honest. You could use some of your other tags you've learned. Does get data come with a timestamp? Get data is only as good as the source returning it. So if you have a RESTful endpoint and they're smart enough in their payload, whether it be JSON or whatnot, to include a timestamp, but it's not guaranteed. No, it's not. Maybe inside of your developer tools, you may be able to get a timestamp, but again, that's not really the true time of when that data has been kind of returned from the server. We're getting into some gray areas here, right? Of specifics. It's once you get into date and time, forget about it. There's whole other libraries around that stuff too. All right, let's try to power through this. All right, there's a lot of content to cover. So, all right, so we kind of went off on a couple good examples there, but yeah, I mean, I can talk about these elements all day, and there's like 30 of them. I'm going to give you about 6 or 7 of them, and then you can go explore. Label represents the caption for an item to use in the user interface, so we use labels a lot, right? Associating a label with an input has a lot of good advantages. So you can do this thing here where you have this label with the attribute cheese is linked to this name and this ID. So we know there's some relationship here between this label and this input box, which in fact, if you look at that now, the type has changed now. Instead of text, a text box, it's a checkbox. And the browser is smart enough to know that now it's going to display this control here. And there's many of them, right? So if you have that relationship, the label text is not visually associated with the corresponding text input. Not only is it associated in that way, programmatically it is also associated, which means when we talk about accessibility again, and you know what, maybe I should get a screen reader. I haven't installed it for a while, and show you how that works. I had to do it for a project, an accessibility project, about making these forms accessible, and the screen reader will basically read back to you in a very kind of robotic way, like not like Siri, but a very kind of ominous voice, right? It's kind of funny. Anyhow, it assists those users that have that technology. And in some it's not necessary, but if you ever get into those kind of projects, it's good practice, right? Also, when you're clicking or tabbing the input, it actually provides an advantage to anybody who's trying to activate it. So on a touchscreen device, right? So it actually, it'll form that relationship for you. The browser of the device or operating system knows that these two are related. And when you're talking about a validation and all these things, it's a good practice. Again, so now we have that text box, right? So now we have an input, and if you notice, instead of a checkbox, we've turned it to text, and we have more attributes on it. We have an ID and name, which is important for different selectors in CSS. We have an attribute called required. Here we actually have another attribute called min length and max length. So again, built-in validation, it'll actually check that those characters are that specification, which is incredible. I'm loving HTML5, to be honest, because I've worked on HTML1. So these elements, you know, they accept data from the user, which we said, and then a wide variety of input types, controls, widgets are available on the device and user agent. Input is the most powerful and complex in all HTML due to the sheer number of combination of input types, right? This one you're going to use everywhere, and even to this day, I see new attributes that surprise me and what it can do, and this is what it is, right? This is what the basis of grabbing user data. Is the label connected to the text through the ID? No, the label is connected by this for attribute, right? It's basically linking, to your point, yes, for ID, right? But we also include the name at sometimes, because different languages and different devices also look at the name. So you need both. I would say best practice, you don't know how many bugs have come out of the fact that you missed one of these, right? And that's a bad example, because name equals name is a bad example, but should be first name. Difference between name and ID. It's the ID is the unique identifier, which is what you would think would be used, but for some reason, some older devices look at name, and also it just has some legacy value to it, and there's some selectors in CSS and some selectors in jQuery that look at the name. I always look at ID, right? But I have made so many mistakes not including this name function. So somebody will probably give me a question here. So both should have the same name value. Yeah, they're both basically, they both reference the same thing.
So basically, for legacy browser support or different multi-platform support, we use both, but more or less both are like the same.
Both are like the same, but you'll just get caught up sometimes if you don't include this one, because there may be some package, script language, or utility out there that is looking for this value here as a preference to the ID. You could change them, but you would have to make sure that your code base that you're using as a selector or what have you that is linked to this is also backfilled, right? So it's up to you really what you want to do with that. I think a good practice is maybe just keeping them the same, just so you don't have to change code in different places. All right, so another input is another input element that can be used in the web-based forms that we use quite a bit is the select. It's a drop-down control that we can use, right? Inside of this parent tag, there are many children nested tags, which are options. Every option should have an attribute called value that contains the value. Maybe it might contain an ID. And then we have the name value of that. So there is some trickiness around this. If there's no value attribute included, the value defaults to the text, which is maybe unwanted, to be honest, but it does do that. So if you don't include this, this value here would be automatically given to the value, right? But it's better to include something unique that that you may want, right? Because you may want IDs to be, because when we're talking about the values, we're talking about what will be submitted to be persisted if we're doing a post. You know, what are we going to save, or would we rather save an ID that matches some data structure in the back end, or do we want to do a lookup on the name, right? We probably want a value hidden that's maybe a unique identifier that we would do. So one thing to also note is when a page loads, the selected option is the one that is the defaulted one, right? So if we wanted Angular to be selected by default instead of please select an option, we would have a selected attribute there. Now, you get into this kind of thing when you're doing when you're programming, right? For instance, I'm working on a store widget. If the current store is I don't know, Yorkdale Mall, then when they come to that page, that should be selected as the item that has been saved, right? So we would have to figure out how to programmatically set the selected value. But for your HTML markup, you're going to just hard code selected there, and that attribute will work when you load the page. Another big one, now we have a text area. We might want multi-line text. We might have a user feedback form or review. So we want something a little bigger than just that text box area. Sorry, the text box, which is, you know, is a very kind of narrow kind of text. You could have, you really don't want to write a novel inside of there. You would rather use a big kind of control to capture all of that. Same kind of deal. We have an ID attribute. We associate that with the label, right? So this is not actually associating it that right. This should be dream, but right now it's changed, so that's gonna be a broken link. It should probably say dream, but that would do a name. So the name attribute to set the name of the associated data point submitted to the server when the server form is submitted. All right, sorry, so I had forgotten that. So the form itself looks at the name. So this is very easy to forget, because when you're dealing with markup, you're very explicit. You're looking for the ID, right? But the form submission, when you submit back, it looks at the name. That's confusing, and that is very confusing, right? So, but it's a good idea for consistency as browser defaults, right, to default them the same, unless there is a reason why you want your markup to refer to some ID and this to be different. Yeah, so that's the distinction, and it's very easy to forget. Is that the form looks at the name, and the markup looks at the ID. And I had forgotten that, to be honest, right now. I just include it by default. I just always keep it because I want to keep the page working, and I'm consistent. So that's the definition there. Button element, very, very straightforward. We already talked about button. All right. Do characters work? Do name characters work? Sorry, I'm not sure of the context.
We're talking here if you are from China and your name is expressed in Mandarin characters. Can I put your name as a set of Mandarin characters? Which means
Oh,
now
you're
we-
saying for the browser as long as there's no special characters in there, then sure. I mean, oh, you're saying like the Japanese symbols? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's got the language. Everything is a symbol.
Yes. If it's a symbol, then, you know, I have never tried it before. I don't know. It depends on the browser, right? I would think that Google Chrome is an North American browser. It may have issues. The engine may not be able to decipher those characters. I'm sure in China they have their own browser sets that deal with their own symbols, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes
Okay.
sometimes it comes down to that. That'd be interesting test though. I'd like to see a form written in Mandarin and see if it works. That would be an awesome test. I expect explosions, to be honest, in terms of debugging that, but that would be my guess. All right, so if I miss any, you can just talk me through them. But yeah, so should we have both? I answered that. So name is for form, IDs for the markup, program images use name for form post. Yep, that's right. That's why I include both. Are the columns related to the number of characters per row? Columns. When we get into columns, I believe we're talking about we're not talking about rows, we're talking about columns, right?
In the previous slide.
Sorry? Oh, previous slide.
Previous slide.
Let's look at the previous slide. All right, rows.
Yes, and calls.
Columns, yes, you're right. Yeah, so in the text area, this is saying 5 rows deep, so it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and basically this is height and width. Height and width. Yeah, I guess it's better in this way to talk about columns and rows. Personally, I like height and width, but I guess they're saying, you know, you could have a height on this, but you could have this at 100, but you only want 5 rows of text. So it basically kind of translate then inside of this text as you're typing the number of characters it's going to allow. Does rows and columns come into CSS? CSS, I know jQuery has columns and rows like you wouldn't believe. So jQuery is built on top of CSS, so I would say yes. But we will get into that shortly. All right, so continuing on, button is what we said it is. We already kind of went over it. It's pretty basic, right? A button, but it has many attributes, and I'm only giving you one, just because I don't have enough room on my slide. And we can look at button, but attribute, one big one right away is disabled, right? Is it disabled or not? And that can go right inside of this markup. So maybe we need to toggle, right? A very good example is when you click once, you need to disable that button so somebody doesn't keep submitting that form, right? Many times, some very bad sites, when you go to purchase something online and you click buy, they'll throw up a window and say, please don't click it again because we're working. Really, they should disable that button so you can't make the mistake, right? So that's a major attribute. So disable is a Boolean attribute, prevents the user from interacting with it again. It basically grays it out. Firefox, unlike other browsers, persistent disabled state across page loads. So use autocomplete attribute to control it. So this is saying that when you're using Firefox, you have to use some other way to do this. And this is just getting into the behavior of those different browsers, right? Yeah, that's unfortunate about this line of business, but yeah, we have to worry about all this stuff. All right. So time check here, 9. Oh, we're getting late here. Okay, so let me stop after this slide, and maybe we'll take a smaller break, but we still got a little bit more to go through. Global attributes. So we've already talked about attributes a lot, and you got to remember on each element there's a list of global ones that apply to all elements, and then there's some that are kind of local to the element itself, and you need to look at the MDM to really understand what they are. If you need one, you just reference it. So global attributes are attributes across all these HTML elements. They can be used on all elements. They might not have some effect on some. You could put one on, it's not going to break it would throw a warning in that validator, but the page is not going to like break, but it may not have no effect is what they're trying to say. So global attributes may be specific on HTML elements, even though they're not specific in the standard. That means that any non-standard elements must still permit these attributes, even though using those elements mean that the document is no longer HTML5 compliant, which is then all of those errors, warnings you may get in the validator. For example, HTML5 compliant browsers hide content marked as hidden, like there would be hidden and then it marks it, even though foo is not a valid element. So what it's saying is it's not going to break, it'll just hide some non-compliant elements if it's not in the standard. So here's a list of global attributes. I just wanted to mention one, because this will be used in CSS and you can use this everywhere. It's the class, and we've already seen it before. That class will allow you to apply a CSS style sheet class to that element, and this is throughout. So when we get into cascading style sheets, this is how we link it up. And classes allow CSS and JavaScript to select. We talked a lot about selectors, class selectors, and then we get into methods like document, get element by class name, and that's called a selector. So, you know, get all of the alternating rows that have a class on them called, row color. You could select all 30 of them and do something with them. Once you got them all, you could turn them red or something like that and make them flash. So you could do something like that. So I got probably 10 more slides. I think I've already gone over the 45 minutes, but yeah, so let's quickly look at the lab here. So if we continue on, now we're going to get into forms. So this one here is to create an unordered list. That should be fairly straightforward. And you don't have to do this. You can do whatever you want. I just put some random stuff in there. Maybe I was hungry at the time, I don't know. But really what we're after is some of these form controls. So we want to create a form that looks like this. And there's no input there if you notice. And let's take a look at that. But what we want is, we want to create a form using a form tag. We want to use something called a field set that wraps everything around it. And then we want to have two buttons, one that actually will redirect and one that does nothing. And then it's basically talking about you need to look up some attributes there.
So,
all right.
Mike, can I ask you a quick one? For exercise 4,
Yes.
I actually did the unordered and the nesting, but it didn't come